modern superheroes.
Imagine a country where foreign intelligence operates in the shadows, recruiting locals through bribery, blackmail, and manipulation, all to destabilize an entire region. This isn't a novel or a distant history lesson. It's happening right now in the small, often overlooked country of Moldova, nestled between Ukraine and Romania. Moldova may seem unimportant at first glance, yet it sits at the crossroads of powerful geopolitical interests, a battleground where influence, control, and secrecy shape the future. To some, Moldova might just be a small country with limited global significance. But to Russia, and especially to its intelligence agency, the FSB, Moldova represents a gateway. It's a testing ground for covert tactics that extend far beyond its borders. In Moldova, the FSB experiments with influence operations, fine-tuning methods that can disrupt and destabilize without ever firing a shot. For Moscow, Moldova's fragile democracy and strategic position make it a prime target for infiltration, manipulation, and control. But why Moldova? Why would a country thousands of miles away become such a focus for Russian operatives? What are the methods used to weave influence into the fabric of a society? To sway elections, create instability, and compromise leaders? What lengths will an intelligence agency go to manipulate an entire nation? How are agents recruited, and what secrets do they hold? One man, Pavel Belomesnik, knows the answers. Pavel's story isn't just an insider's account. It's a rare glimpse into the tactics of the FSB, a shadowy organization that operates with near impunity. Once a part of Russia's vast intelligence network, Pavel witnessed firsthand the scale, sophistication, and brutality of these operations. His journey from insider to whistleblower reveals how the FSB controls narratives, uses economic influence, and turns ordinary people into tools of manipulation, all with a singular goal: maintaining power and extending influence. Pavel's knowledge isn't theoretical. He experienced the inner workings of the FSB up close, understanding their strategies to coerce, entrap, and control. His account exposes the agency's goals, their methods, and, most chillingly, the mindset that drives them. From fake business deals to covert influence campaigns, Pavel's story pulls back the curtain on a world where borders are mere technicalities, where influence is bought, stolen, and manufactured, and where secrecy and silence are the most powerful weapons. But exposing these secrets comes with its own risks. In sharing his story, Pavel confronts a system that thrives on fear and shadows. For him, revealing this tale of manipulation, control, and betrayal means taking a stand against a machine that views individuals as expendable tools, nations as chess pieces, and influence as the ultimate prize. And while most would never dare to step out of this shadow, Pavel knows that telling the truth is the only way to reveal the FSB's hidden influence, not just in Moldova, but across Europe. In this story, nothing is what it seems. Behind every handshake, every whispered promise, and every well-timed favor lies a calculated agenda. It's a story of alliances forged in secret, of officials turned by coercion and blackmail, of deals made with hidden motives. It's a reminder that in the world of modern intelligence, reality itself can be a carefully constructed illusion. For Pavel, sharing these secrets isn't just about setting the record straight. It's about shedding light on a reality where power isn't just taken. It's manipulated, often in ways that are invisible to the public eye. So, what does the FSB want with Moldova? And what does Moldova's fate tell us about the future of Europe? Pavel's story challenges us to look closer, to question the world we live in, and to recognize the price of influence in an age of hidden agendas and manufactured truths. Pavel's revelations could change our understanding of modern intelligence and the reach of foreign influence. In this tale, Moldova is only the beginning. Pavel Belomesnik's journey into Russia's intelligence world wasn't one he chose, but rather one he found himself drawn into as his business career progressed. Born in a small Russian town, Pavel was ambitious, knowing from a young age that success in Russia often meant building the right connections. Like many young professionals, he was driven to succeed, and he understood that powerful circles in Russia meant everything. In the early days of his career, Pavel's encounters with the FSB were almost imperceptible, just part of navigating Russian business. At first, it seemed like business as usual. He'd see certain deals move forward more smoothly, some permits come easier, and business figures aligned with state interests. He saw people around him cooperating with government-linked circles, gaining privileges that seemed to open doors others couldn't. But as he soon realized, some of these arrangements came with strings attached. The deeper he ventured into these circles, the clearer it became that the FSB's influence was far-reaching. He watched as the agency subtly guided the actions of powerful figures in media, business, and politics. Though the FSB didn't directly control his actions, Its presence was a reminder that success often meant silent loyalty to the state. Eventually, he became aware of operations extending beyond Russia. Moldova, he learned, was becoming a new area of focus for the FSB. This small country, nestled between Romania and Ukraine, had vulnerabilities that made it a strategic point of interest for Russia. To the FSB, Moldova represented an opportunity, a nation where influence could be bought, traded, and strengthened through soft power and manipulation. It was a testing ground for the agency, a place where it could implement its influence tactics without arousing much suspicion. Over time, Pavel began hearing about how the FSB was weaving a web of influence in Moldova, using strategies designed to mold it into a pro-Russian ally. Pavel became more involved in projects that touched on these influence tactics, and his understanding of the FSB's approach grew. He learned how the agency would offer financial support, make promises to business leaders, and, when necessary, apply pressure. Local politicians, business people, and community figures in Moldova became unwitting, and sometimes willing, participants in a larger scheme, for the FSBs in a larger scheme, for the FSBs in a larger scheme. For the FSB, Moldova was a bridge to the West, an entry point to extend influence into Europe while remaining under the radar. Pavel's knowledge of these tactics grew, and so did his discomfort. In 2018, he was offered a direct role within these networks, a chance to become part of the agency's influence machine. The rewards were substantial, and the promise of security was enticing. But Pavel knew that accepting would mean giving up his autonomy. Once inside, he realized there would be no leaving. This was the turning point for him. Over the next few years, Pavel struggled with what he had seen. He had witnessed how lives were manipulated, how influence seeped through communities, and how individuals became tools of a larger agenda. In late 2022, Pavel made a difficult decision. He would leave Russia, abandoning the career he had built. He fled to the United States, seeking refuge in a country where he believed he could finally reveal what he knew. Pavel's knowledge of the FSB's covert networks is rare. His first-hand experiences with Russia's influence campaigns in Moldova give him an unmatched perspective on the reach of modern intelligence operations. For Pavel, sharing his story is about more than revealing secrets. It's about exposing a system that operates in the shadows, where influence, not force, is the most powerful weapon. To many, Moldova might seem like an unlikely focal point for international intrigue. Small, landlocked, and relatively underdeveloped, it sits quietly between Romania and Ukraine. But to the FSB and Russian intelligence, Moldova is far from inconsequential. In fact, it's considered a gateway, strategically located with ties to both Eastern Europe and Russia, making it a prime target for influence operations that extend beyond its borders. Moldova's location is critical. For centuries, this region has served as a bridge between East and West, a place where cultural and political tensions between Europe and Russia frequently intersect. For the FSB, Moldova represents a foothold, a place where influence over a small but strategically positioned nation could extend Russia's reach into Europe without direct confrontation. If Moldova aligns itself with Russia, it not only brings the Kremlin closer to the European Union, but also strengthens Russian influence along the EU's eastern frontier. The FSB has clear objectives here: to maintain a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe by aligning Moldova with pro-Russian interests and resisting Western alliances. A stable, pro-Russian Moldova serves Russia's geopolitical agenda in two ways. First, it creates a buffer zone between Russia and the West, one that discourages NATO and EU expansion. Second, it allows Russia to shape narratives and policies in a region that directly impacts European security and stability. Moldova is a chess piece in Russia's broader game of influence, and the FSB has invested heavily in securing this asset. Pavel learned that the FSB's strategy in Moldova was designed to be subtle but impactful. The agency didn't need open alliances, it needed covert influence. They targeted Moldova's leaders, businesses and media outlets, looking to embed Russian influence quietly but firmly. The approach was methodical. First, identify key players in Moldovan society. Next, draw them into Moscow's sphere through financial incentives, promises of power, and, if necessary, blackmail. This way, Russian interests would be represented at every level of Moldovan society without any official presence. The FSB's tactics were especially effective because Moldova's government, economy, and media landscape were vulnerable. Moldova had limited resources to resist, and with financial incentives from Russian-aligned businesses, the FSB found fertile ground. To the outside world, Moldova's government and media might seem independent, but beneath the surface, the FSB had quietly planted seeds of influence, ensuring that key figures would support Russia's interests or, at the very least, avoid siding with the West. Through Moldova, the FSB found an indirect pathway into Europe. Once embedded, this influence could reach into neighboring Romania, potentially touching the European Union through shared cultural and economic ties. Moldova, for the FSB, was not just a country to be controlled, but a platform to push Russian narratives across Eastern Europe and counter Western influence without triggering a visible confrontation. Pavel came to understand that Moldova was just one part of a much larger operation. The FSB's interest in controlling Moldova was as much about testing methods as it was about gaining influence. Moldova served as a proving ground where Russia could refine tactics of manipulation and control that could then be deployed elsewhere. For the FSB, this small nation was a valuable experiment, a chance to perfect the art of influence without borders. In Moldova, the FSB didn't need to enforce control openly. By embedding loyalists, quietly supporting pro-Russian leaders, and spreading disinformation, they achieved control that was invisible to most, yet powerful enough to guide Moldova's future in Moscow's favor. For the FSB, Moldova was a demonstration of how influence could be wielded subtly, a model that, if successful, could be replicated in other vulnerable countries on Europe's edge. This is the stage Pavel's story unfolds against, a country used as a pawn, and an agency committed to making Moldova a hidden ally in Russia's silent advance westward. The FSB's influence in Moldova didn't rely on brute force or overt displays of power. Instead, they operated through careful selection and subtle manipulation, often approaching individuals who didn't even realize they were potential recruits. For the FSB, recruitment was about finding people with the right combination of access, ambition, and, most importantly, vulnerability. These weren't just government officials or military figures. The FSB cast a wide net, looking for business leaders, journalists, academics, and community figures, anyone who held sway over public opinion or policy. In Moldova, economic instability and political uncertainty created an ideal environment for recruitment. The FSB took advantage of these conditions, looking for individuals who were either struggling financially, frustrated with the system, or eager for career advancement. It wasn't always about ideology. Often, the FSB found that financial strain or personal ambition was enough to open doors. With a few promises or incentives, they could turn potential recruits into willing participants or, at the very least, silent allies. One approach involved offering financial assistance or career opportunities, which seemed harmless at first. Moldovan professionals facing stagnant wages or limited resources were offered lucrative contracts, consulting roles, or grants from Russian-backed businesses or organizations. The initial offer seemed simple: extra income or a step up the career ladder. But these benefits were rarely free. They came with expectations, unspoken at first but increasingly clear over time. Recipients often found themselves quietly pressured to align with Russian interests or to provide information on their networks, discussions, or plans. In many cases, the FSB's recruiters used a psychological approach, targeting insecurities or personal struggles. Pavel described one instance in detail, a story that captured the depth of manipulation the agency was willing to use. This individual, a young Moldovan journalist named Andrei, was well known for his ambition and drive. He was outspoken about corruption in Moldova and had a significant following. The FSB recognized his potential influence over public opinion and saw an opportunity. First, they approached Andrei through a middleman, a contact who posed as a supportive businessman interested in funding Andrei's investigative work. The man offered Andrei a substantial grant to support his reporting on government issues. For Andrei, it seemed like an incredible opportunity to expand his work without compromising his values. At first, the arrangement seemed legitimate, even empowering. Andrei received funding, access to resources, and connections that opened doors he hadn't even considered. But over time, subtle changes started to appear in their expectations. The middleman encouraged Andrei to focus his reports on specific government failings, especially areas where the current leadership appeared weak. Andrei began receiving suggestions about the tone and direction of his stories, phrases to use, narratives to highlight, criticisms to emphasize. When Andrei hesitated, the relationship shifted. Suddenly, his backer wasn't just a supportive friend, he became insistent, reminding Andrei of the help he had received, the debts he owed, and the contacts who had invested time and money in his career. The support Andrei once viewed as an opportunity now felt like a trap. When he voiced his discomfort, he received subtle threats, references to how his career could be destroyed if he refused to collaborate. Through these small pressures, the FSB had taken Andrei, a talented, independent journalist, and molded him into a tool of influence. His reports slowly shifted from independent journalism to content subtly shaped by Russian interests. Readers wouldn't have noticed the change, but to those following Andrei's career closely, the influence was clear. He was still critical of the government, but now his criticisms aligned almost perfectly with Moscow's agenda. Andrei's story isn't unique. It illustrates a larger strategy used by the FSB, where promises of support or funding became instruments of control. By identifying individuals who were ambitious but vulnerable, the FSB could build a network of seemingly independent voices who, knowingly or unknowingly, furthered Russian interests. For the FSB, these agents didn't need to be loyalists or ideologues. They simply needed to be influenced, nudged in the right direction until they became useful assets. By manipulating people's vulnerabilities and ambitions, the FSB created an invisible network of voices, figures, and leaders in Moldova who subtly steered the nation's narrative towards Russia's favor, one report or business decision at a time. This method of recruitment, quiet, indirect, and deeply personal, was one of the FSB's most powerful tools. It allowed them to shape opinions, direct conversations, and influence decisions, all without drawing attention to themselves. For the FSB, every person they influenced was another thread in a web that extended from Moldova across Eastern Europe, securing Russian influence in the region one individual at a time. The FSB's operations in Moldova extended beyond recruitment and influence. One of their most effective tools for establishing control was through business ventures that appeared legitimate on the surface but were carefully designed to entrap and manipulate. These deals weren't just about money, they were about creating leverage over individuals in positions of power. By offering economic opportunities, the FSB drew leaders, business owners, and government officials into partnerships that soon became traps, binding them to Russian interests in ways that were difficult to escape. For the FSB, business deals were an ideal cover. Moldova's economy was struggling, and foreign investments from Russian entities were often welcomed. The FSB capitalized on this need by setting up companies that promised significant investment and development. To Moldovan officials and business leaders, these deals seemed like a win-win. Financial support for their ventures and connections to Moscow, a powerful ally. But what these partners didn't realize was that the FSB rarely gave without expecting something in return. One such story Pavel recounted involved a prominent Moldovan politician named Ion. Ion had built a strong reputation as a reformer, promising economic growth and stability to the people. When representatives from a major Russian firm approached him with an investment proposal, it seemed like a remarkable opportunity. The firm, backed by Russian investors, offered Ion's office a substantial investment in infrastructure projects, promising to revitalize local industries and provide jobs for thousands. For Ion, this proposal was exactly what he needed to strengthen his standing and deliver on his promises. The deal appeared straightforward, even generous. The investment would bring immediate benefits, and the firm's representatives assured Ion that Moscow was committed to supporting Moldova's development. There was no mention of politics or allegiance, only a focus on mutual economic benefit. But what seemed like a blessing quickly became something far more complex. Within months, Ion found that the firm's representatives were becoming increasingly involved in his decision-making. They began suggesting recommendations for hiring contractors, advising on budget allocations, and subtly influencing which companies would be awarded contracts. When Ion pushed back, they reminded him of the investment they had brought into Moldova, making it clear that their support came with expectations. Gradually, the relationship evolved. The FSB-backed firm wasn't satisfied with economic cooperation. They wanted political influence. Ion was asked to support certain policies favorable to Russian interests and to advocate for closer ties with Moscow. If he resisted, they hinted that the projects might face delays or that funds could be redirected. As he tried to push back, Ion realized he was trapped. Any refusal could jeopardize the investments he had promised, damaging his reputation and undermining his political career. The FSB's representatives also made sure Ion was personally tied to the arrangement. They encouraged him to accept personal financial benefits. Small gifts, direct payments, incentives that seemed harmless but soon became evidence of favors. These transactions weren't large enough to draw attention, but were enough to give the FSB leverage over him. Now, Ion faced the risk of exposure, of being painted as a leader who had compromised himself for financial gain. The promise of economic development had turned into a trap, one where he was forced to prioritize Moscow's agenda over his own nation's interests. Ion's story was far from unique. Through business ventures, the FSB had crafted an elaborate system of economic entanglements that served as both incentives and threats. To leaders like Ion, these deals initially seemed like opportunities to boost their careers and fulfill their promises to the public. But as Pavel learned, The FSB carefully structured these agreements to ensure that leaders would eventually find themselves dependent on Russian support, or else face the consequences. For the FSB, these manipulative business deals accomplished two goals. They allowed the agency to insert itself into Moldova's economy, gradually controlling key industries and aligning them with Russian interests. At the same time, they provided a way to bind Moldovan leaders to Moscow's agenda, using their own financial benefits and political promises against them. By setting up these deals, the FSB gained more than influence. They gained control. Through financial entanglements and implied threats, they ensured that Moldovan leaders and business owners were too compromised to oppose Russian interests, creating a network of influence that appeared cooperative on the surface but was coercive at its core. Pavel saw that this system was not only effective but insidious. It allowed the FSB to maintain an invisible grip on Moldova's economy and its leaders without ever appearing as a direct aggressor. To the public, these investments looked like much-needed economic support. But behind closed doors, they were a trap, one that left Moldova's leaders beholden to Moscow and unable to act freely, ensuring that Russian interests would always come first. The FSB's strategy for influence in Moldova went beyond recruitment and business deals. It relied heavily on the systematic corruption of officials across every level of government. Moldova's political structure, already under strain, became a vulnerable target for the FSB's methods. From local mayors to high-ranking government figures, the FSB sought to co-opt individuals whose roles, though varying in power, could serve their broader agenda. These officials weren't just expected to comply. They were pressured, manipulated, and, if necessary, threatened into submission. Corruption became the FSB's primary tool for securing loyalty. For those willing to accept, the agency offered financial rewards, benefits, and favors. These weren't always grand gestures, but often small, consistent payments that accumulated over time, creating a sense of indebtedness. For others, the FSB applied pressure, quietly letting officials know that dissent would come at a price. The agency tailored its approach to each individual, knowing exactly how much incentive or intimidation was needed to achieve compliance. One case Pavel described involved a local mayor named Victor, who was well respected in his community. Victor had spent years building his reputation, focusing on development projects and keeping promises to his constituents. His popularity made him influential, someone the FSB recognized as a potential asset. At first, the agency approached him subtly through intermediaries who offered small grants to support local initiatives. These grants came with no strings attached, or so it seemed. Victor accepted the support, seeing it as an opportunity to improve his community, and for a while everything seemed above board. But over time, the offers grew larger, and the grants turned into personal gifts. An envelope here, a favor there, access to resources that made his job easier. Victor found himself relying more on these gifts to support his projects, unaware that he was slowly being drawn into the FSB's influence. When the time came, the FSB made their expectations clear. Representatives approached Victor with a specific request. They wanted his help in advancing pro-Russian policies at the local level. It was a simple task on the surface, one that wouldn't draw much attention. But Victor hesitated. He didn't agree with the policies, and he knew that his community valued its independence. Refusing, however, wasn't as simple as he thought. The FSB's intermediaries reminded him of the financial support he had received over the years. They hinted that without his cooperation, future funding might be jeopardized and his ability to support local projects would be compromised. When Victor continued to resist, the pressure intensified. Suddenly, he found himself facing accusations of financial misconduct with local media, some of whom were quietly backed by the FSB, raising questions about his administration's transparency. The FSB made it clear that these accusations could be managed, or they could escalate depending on his cooperation. For Victor, the message was clear. He could either align with the FSB's agenda or risk losing everything he'd built. In the end, Victor capitulated. He agreed to support the policies, framing them as beneficial to his community. The pro-Russian stance he had once resisted became part of his public platform. To his constituents, the change might have seemed subtle, but to those who understood the FSB's tactics, it was a clear victory. Victor's influence had been co-opted, his independence compromised, and his loyalty redirected. He became another thread in the FSB's web of control, a respected local leader now pushing policies that aligned with Russian interests. Victor's story was far from isolated. The FSB had learned that they could corrupt officials at every level by either offering incentives or creating consequences. Small-town mayors, regional officials, and even national figures faced similar pressures. Those who resisted found themselves isolated, their reputations smeared, and their political careers under threat. And for those who cooperated, Rewards were available, but always with the understanding that loyalty to the FSB was not negotiable. This strategy allowed the FSB to embed its influence deep within Moldova's political structure. They didn't need open alliances or dramatic gestures. By targeting individuals and ensuring their compliance through a combination of bribery and blackmail, the FSB secured a network of loyalists across Moldova's government. Each official, each public figure who capitulated, added to their invisible control over the nation. Pavel understood that this web of corruption was designed not only to exert control but to create a sense of dependency. Officials who accepted the FSB's support couldn't easily withdraw. They were bound to the agency's agenda, even if it conflicted with their values or the interests of their communities. By corrupting Moldova's political structure from within, the FSB ensured that Moldova's policies and decisions would increasingly align with Russian interests, all without the need for open intervention. For the FSB, this was influence in its purest form, quiet, coercive, and nearly impossible to trace back to Moscow. And for Moldova, it meant that the people making decisions on their behalf were no longer free to act in their own nation's best interest. In Moldova, the FSB's methods of influence extended beyond officials, businesses, and media. They reached into the country's criminal underworld, leveraging local gangs as another layer of control. Moldova's criminal networks offered the FSB a unique advantage. They provided a way to carry out intimidation, monitor opposition, and enforce compliance without direct involvement. Through these partnerships, the FSB created an atmosphere of fear, silencing dissent and discouraging anyone who might oppose their agenda. For the FSB, criminal groups were an invaluable tool. Local gangs operated outside the bounds of formal law, giving the FSB plausible deniability while using these networks to do their bidding. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. In exchange for protection or immunity from prosecution, these gangs provided the FSB with information, enforced their will, and eliminated potential threats to Russian interests. With the FSB's backing, these criminal groups operated with impunity, free to carry out intimidation tactics that even law enforcement was reluctant to challenge. One example that Pavel recounted involved a group of political activists who had been vocal in their opposition to Russian influence in Moldova. These activists organized rallies, published articles, and encouraged public debate about Moldova's future as an independent nation. They represented a growing movement, one that aimed to challenge pro-Russian policies and bring Moldova closer to the West. But to the FSB, they were a threat that had to be contained. The FSB reached out to a local gang, known for its violent methods, to send a message to the activists. At first, the intimidation was subtle. Members of the gang would appear outside the activists' homes, watching them, following them around the city, and making it clear that they were under surveillance. The activists reported feeling as though they were constantly being watched, a psychological tactic that created an environment of unease and paranoia. When the activists continued their work undeterred, the threats escalated. One night, the leader of the activist group, a man named Daniel, received a direct warning. Members of the gang intercepted him on his way home, surrounding him and delivering a message. If he valued his safety and his family's well-being, he would end his political activities. They reminded him that his actions weren't just putting himself at risk, but also endangering those close to him. For Daniel, the warning was clear, and the risks were real. The gang members made sure he understood that resistance could lead to consequences, both physical and social. Pavel recalled that Daniel's fear was palpable. He had spoken passionately about Moldova's future, but now he faced a personal threat that went beyond political consequences. He was faced with a choice: continue his activism and endanger his family, or step back and abandon the cause he had dedicated himself to. The FSB's use of criminal networks didn't end with intimidation. These gangs were also used for intelligence gathering. They infiltrated activist circles, posing as sympathizers or supporters, gathering information on their plans, contacts, and vulnerabilities. Through this surveillance, the FSB could monitor opposition figures and keep track of potential threats to their influence. With the gangs doing the groundwork, the FSB could keep close tabs on Moldova's political landscape without direct involvement. This partnership created a climate of fear in Moldova, one that went beyond isolated threats. Word spread quickly about the FSB's connections with local criminals, and the knowledge that gangs were monitoring political activities discouraged many from speaking out. Journalists, activists, and community leaders began to feel the pressure, aware that any resistance could lead to encounters with dangerous groups operating under the FSB's guidance. Public gatherings became less frequent, and opposition voices grew quieter as people chose safety over confrontation. By using criminal networks, the FSB effectively silenced dissent in Moldova. These gangs acted as enforcers, keeping opposition figures in check and ensuring that pro-Russian narratives dominated public discourse. The FSB didn't need to make public threats. They had a force willing to do so on their behalf, one that operated outside the law and carried out their agenda with ruthless efficiency. For Pavel, this was one of the most disturbing aspects of the FSB's strategy, watching how they turned criminal elements into an extension of state influence, using fear as a weapon to suppress opposition. This tactic allowed the FSB to maintain a grip on Moldova's political landscape, stifling independence movements and discouraging any push toward Western alignment. Through these covert alliances with criminals, the FSB achieved a level of control that was as effective as it was invisible. For Moldova, it meant that those who dared to question or resist Russian influence did so at their own peril, facing not only political consequences, but personal risks enforced by a powerful underworld. The FSB's influence campaign in Moldova didn't just target individuals, it destabilized the country as a whole, leaving its political institutions fractured and its social fabric strained. By spreading its reach through government, business, media, and even criminal networks, the FSB's presence created an environment where Moldovans no longer knew who they could trust. Public confidence in leaders and institutions plummeted, with people increasingly questioning whether their government truly represented Moldova or was simply a tool for Moscow. For the FSB, this division was by design. Moldova's position as a potential bridge between Europe and Russia made it a valuable asset, but only if it remained under Moscow's influence. To achieve this, the FSB sowed doubt and discord, subtly shifting Moldova's sense of national identity. Over time, the country found itself split, with one segment of society leaning toward Europe and the other inclined toward Russia. In place of unity, the FSB cultivated an atmosphere of suspicion where Moldovans questioned their leaders, their media, and even their neighbors' loyalties. One incident in particular highlighted how deeply this distrust had spread. In a small town square, a group of students organized a rally calling for transparency and a Moldova free from foreign interference. They wanted Moldova to pursue a future rooted in democratic values, independent of external control. Word of the rally spread, and attendance grew quickly. People from all walks of life joined, united by a desire to push Moldova forward. Many of them shared stories of their own experiences with corruption and intimidation, venting frustrations that had been building for years. It became a powerful moment, one that reflected a widespread yearning for a Moldova led by its own people. But as the rally grew, so did the response from pro-Russian forces. Within hours, counter-protesters arrived, blending into the crowd and accusing the rally organizers of betraying Moldova by pushing for Western influence. Tensions escalated, and what had begun as a peaceful gathering quickly devolved into chaos. Arguments turned into shoving, and the square became a battleground between opposing views on Moldova's future. The clash left a deep mark, and although the rally was dispersed, the underlying divisions only deepened. The incident didn't fade quietly. Photos and videos spread across social media, igniting a national conversation. Moldovans who hadn't attended were now watching, seeing the confrontation as a symbol of their country's fractured state. Rumors circulated about the involvement of outside influences in the counter-protests, and public trust in leaders and officials plummeted further. The message was clear: Moldova was no longer fully in control of its own narrative, and the people felt powerless against the forces shaping their future from the shadows. In the days that followed, debates about the rally dominated national discourse. Moldovans openly questioned the loyalty of their leaders, media, and prominent figures. They wondered if key individuals were promoting Moldova's interests or quietly advancing Russia's agenda. Each public figure, journalist, and politician was scrutinized, fueling a public skepticism that grew with each new revelation of corruption or covert Russian ties. This atmosphere of mistrust seeped into every aspect of Moldovan life, eroding social bonds and weakening any sense of collective purpose. For the FSB, this fractured Moldova was exactly the outcome they wanted. A country uncertain of its own identity and plagued by internal conflict was far easier to influence. The agency didn't need Moldovans to fully embrace Russia. They only needed the country to be destabilized enough for Moscow's agenda to thrive. Every protest, every division, and every doubt that arose served to ensure that Moldova's path remained uncertain, vulnerable to manipulation from those who understood how to wield influence quietly. Pavel watched as Moldova shifted from a nation with aspirations for an independent future to one caught in a battle for its own soul. The political instability and social fractures were, to him, clear signs of the FSB's work. What began as a campaign for quiet influence had turned into a national crisis, where Moldovans feared their country's future was no longer theirs to control. The sense of helplessness that swept through Moldova was palpable. People feared that they were losing their country to unseen forces, a reality shaped by foreign influence rather than their own will. For Moldova, the FSB's campaign had not only undermined its institutions, but had also reshaped the very fabric of society, leaving its people divided and uncertain of what lay ahead. For Pavel Belomesnik, the decision to expose the FSB's operations wasn't a simple or easy one. For years, he had observed how the agency operated, watching as it quietly manipulated Moldova, corrupted leaders, and instilled fear across the nation. He had seen the effects firsthand: the people forced into silence, the officials coerced into compliance, the communities torn apart by suspicion and intimidation. Yet, despite everything he knew, he hesitated to speak out. The risks were high, and he was all too aware of what the FSB could do to those who crossed them. At first, Pavel tried to distance himself, thinking that staying silent would keep him safe. He told himself that speaking out wouldn't make a difference, that he was just one person. But as time passed, his perspective changed. He began to see that his silence, in a way, made him complicit. By withholding what he knew, he was allowing the FSB's influence to continue unchecked, leaving Moldova and its people vulnerable to a power they could neither see nor fight. Pavel's turning point came during a conversation with a friend, a former colleague who had also witnessed the FSB's tactics. The friend expressed his frustration, sharing stories of people whose lives had been derailed by the agency's methods. He spoke about activists who had been silenced, journalists who had been pressured, and families torn apart by intimidation. For Pavel, these stories hit close to home, and he realized that this wasn't just about Moldova or Russian influence. It was about ordinary people, people whose lives had been altered by an agency that operated in complete secrecy. That conversation stuck with him, and Pavel found himself haunted by the stories he'd heard. He began to see that remaining silent wasn't a neutral act. It was a choice that had consequences. He could either let these stories remain hidden, or he could step forward and risk everything to reveal the truth. Ultimately, it was this realization that pushed Pavel to act. He decided that the stakes were too high, both for himself and for Moldova, to remain in the shadows. Speaking out was dangerous. He knew the FSB's reach was long and their methods ruthless. But Pavel understood that revealing the truth was the only way to give Moldova, and possibly other nations, a chance to resist these covert tactics. By exposing the FSB's operations, he hoped to shed light on the unseen forces that manipulated people's lives and futures from the shadows. Pavel's decision to speak wasn't just a step against the FSB. It was a personal risk, a choice that came with real dangers. He knew that going public would make him a target. The FSB was known for its intolerance of defectors, and Pavel was now risking his safety, his future, and possibly even his life. But in the end, he realized that the personal cost was one he was willing to bear. For Pavel, exposing the FSB's influence wasn't only about righting wrongs, it was about breaking the silence that allowed these wrongs to continue. This choice to expose the truth marked a turning point, a moment when Pavel stepped away from safety and into uncertainty. But for the first time in years, he felt he was taking control, not just of his own life, but of a story that had been hidden for too long. In speaking out, Pavel found a purpose, a commitment to revealing the truth about an agency that operated without accountability, leaving a trail of unseen destruction in its wake. And though the risks were high, he felt he could no longer look away. Pavel Belomesnik's decision to speak out against the FSB wasn't just a personal act of bravery, it was a rare and powerful stand against an agency that thrives on secrecy and silence. His story is a testament to the courage it takes to expose a hidden force as vast and ruthless as the FSB, especially when so few dare to confront it openly. For Pavel, whistleblowing wasn't simply about sharing secrets. It was about breaking the cycle of manipulation and fear that the FSB had carefully woven around individuals, communities, and entire nations. In sharing his story, Pavel hoped to do more than just reveal facts. He wanted to make people aware of the subtle and insidious ways influence can seep into daily life. He wanted the world to understand that the FSB's tactics aren't limited to espionage or grand conspiracies. They are woven into everyday interactions, hidden within alliances, business deals, media narratives, and political alliances. By exposing these operations, Pavel aimed to open people's eyes to the reality that influence doesn't always come in obvious forms. Often, it's a slow erosion, a quiet manipulation that most won't see until it's too late. Pavel's message isn't just about Moldova, it's about the broader implications of unchecked power and influence. His story serves as a reminder that no country, no community, and no individual is truly immune to the pull of foreign interests. In a world where information and narratives can be shaped from afar, Pavel's story is a call for vigilance. He wants people to recognize the importance of questioning, of looking beyond surface appearances, and of not allowing their communities or leaders to be drawn into webs of foreign control. Beyond awareness, Pavel's legacy is a call for resilience. He knows that the FSB's tactics work best in silence, in environments where people feel isolated or helpless. By coming forward, he hopes to inspire others to speak out, to share their experiences, and to stand up against manipulation, no matter how overwhelming the forces may seem. Pavel believes that true resilience comes from a society that is informed, united, and unwilling to let fear or intimidation dictate its path. For Pavel, this legacy is deeply personal. He knows the risks, and he understands that his choice to speak has likely placed him in permanent danger. Yet he believes that the personal cost is outweighed by the impact of revealing the truth. He wants his story to encourage others in Moldova and beyond to recognize that while the forces of influence may be powerful, they are not invincible. When people are informed and united, they can resist, they can push back, and they can safeguard their communities from hidden control. Pavel's legacy is a powerful reminder that whistleblowing is more than an act of defiance. It's an act of courage that, in some cases, may protect the very fabric of society. His message is simple yet profound. That awareness and resilience are the strongest defenses against those who seek to control from the shadows. By exposing the truth, Pavel hopes he has planted a seed of vigilance, one that will help communities guard themselves against the invisible forces that would otherwise shape their future without their consent. Pavel's revelations have shed light on the hidden operations of the FSB in Moldova, but they also raise unsettling questions that remain unanswered. His story offers a rare glimpse into how influence campaigns are designed to control from behind the scenes. Yet it leaves us wondering just how widespread these tactics might be. If Moldova, a small country at the edge of Europe, could be quietly manipulated by foreign interests, what does this mean for other vulnerable regions around the world? Pavel's story hints at a larger, more pervasive network of influence, one that may reach far beyond Moldova's borders. The tactics he described, recruitment through business deals, the quiet manipulation of leaders, the intimidation of dissenters, the use of criminal networks, are effective tools of control that could be adapted to almost any setting. This raises an alarming question. Could similar campaigns be taking place in other countries? Are other communities, governments, and regions experiencing the same silent pressures, facing forces they can neither see nor fight? For Pavel, these are the questions that make his story even more urgent. Moldova might not be the only target. The FSB's tactics could be unfolding in other fragile states, in places where economic instability, political division, or cultural tensions make them ripe for influence. Pavel's decision to come forward is a call for greater vigilance, not just in Moldova, but everywhere that foreign influence might quietly threaten independence. As Pavel's story continues to unfold, it serves as both a revelation and a warning. It reminds us that influence campaigns often operate in the shadows, leaving trails of quiet compliance, eroded trust, and fractured societies in their wake. The question now is who might be next, and whether the world will recognize these operations before it's too late. For Moldova, Pavel's revelations may be just the beginning. His courage has sparked a new awareness, and while many questions remain unanswered, his story has ignited a desire to uncover the full scope of these hidden tactics. And for those in other countries facing similar threats, his story is a reminder. The power to resist begins with seeing the forces at play. Pavel's account closes one chapter of understanding but opens many more, leaving us with an unsettling realization. The operations he described may not end with Moldova. They may be part of a much larger design, one that has yet to be fully revealed.